Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm very, very happy to be here, to be invited. One of the things that struck me this morning is that you could see that there were project members that presented, and a word that is not mentioned, avoided, ignored, is Vlaardingen culture. And there was also a video for the bigger audience where that word was used a lot. So apparently there is something there, a tension. That is actually what my presentation is about as well. So for starters, who recognizes the reference in my title? And then I'm talking about coastal Neolithic. That refers to a classic paper. Go back in time. Once upon a time, there was no Vlaardingen culture. So after the war, when the first sites were excavated and they stood out, the remains, the ceramics especially, scholars were trying to see where the similarities were. And at a certain moment, they proposed to call this new group Coastal Neolithic. I think actually that is still somewhat implied in the way that we talk about Vlaardingen. To get you started, imagine that you have a beautifully preserved Vlaardingen site. You pick it up and you put it somewhere in Limburg. You lose all the organics. You might even lose a major part of your ceramics. And you might also lose the term Vlaardingen, and we would call it Stein. In other words, this coastal, this wetland connotation was explicitly part of this temporary definition, but I think it's still more or less part of the discussion today. So the question is, of course, is that correct? Or should we perhaps simply rephrase it as being the Neolithic on the coast? Well, I can skip this one. Eventually, in 1962, 1963, this idea of coastal Neolithic was replaced, and then the term Vlaardingen was introduced. And it was also set in contrast to bigger cultural groups surrounding it. So no, it is not Ertebølle, it's not Tierby, it's not Michelsberg, and also not Chassien. This is something new, which we call Vlaardingen. Ever since this was defined, people made use of this term and added to it, and there was an entire list of publications which the term was used. And when you go through them, you see that there are certain elements that are explicitly or implicitly always part of that. And some of those elements, when you bring them together, this is what I would call the Dutch dogma in the title. And that is that in the Dutch wetlands, this transition to farming is a long process in which hunting and gathering remain important parts of the subsistence base. When cereal cultivation and animal husbandry were introduced, these should be considered as add-ons. They were added to a primarily Mesolithic subsistence base. Classic terms in this respect from 1993, broad spectrum economy for late Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and an extended broad spectrum economy for the Neolithic in the wetlands. I think this is a very explicit use of terminology to underline the Mesolithic roots of the subsistence base in the Dutch wetlands. You might say is layer upon layer, a third and final layer. These patterns in the Dutch wetlands are evidence of communities that have adapted to these environments, which were rich in natural resources and provided limited opportunities for farming practices. I think this is the interpretive framework, the paradigm in which a lot of work has been done. Certainly if you have been trained in Leiden, as I've been as well, this is evident. This is how it is. I've been part of that tradition for a long time. I think these are the two elements of this dogma. On the one hand, yes, at a certain moment we see traits that are typical for Neolithic communities, but in terms of subsistence, you could also call these people hunting, gathering, farming communities. They are defined by a landscape setting, wetlands, and they are relatively autarkic. In other words, they're not part of a bigger world where a lot of very Neolithic things are happening. No, they're a bit on the side in these wetlands doing their things that are so perfectly suited to these wetlands. This has been a very successful narrative, and I'm not trying to dismiss it. I'm simply trying to raise questions by stressing that there are other ways to look at it. It has primarily been developed by Leonard Lau Kooijmans, but then also, of course, successfully expanded upon by many of his pupils, and many of those are here present as well, including myself. This is the framework in which we work, and actually the very first time that I really started to reconsider this was thanks to this book by Stephen Shannon, 2018, in which he presents a reanalysis of the transition to farming across Europe. And every case study that he presents is a story of migrants, of farming communities that are able to live in higher densities in regions and basically replace hunter-gatherer communities. And there is one page, I forgot how the section is called, but it is the one continental exception, and that is our case study area, which is possible, but it does raise questions. And the question is is that narrative so successful that even Shannon does not dare to challenge it? Or is it really different? So that's where I started to think. It could be a singularity, or should we perhaps question it? And if we question it, then you might make this move from coastal Neolithic to Neolithic on the coast. Then you might ask yourself whether the differences in preservation between wetland environments and the sandy areas, where we have no evidence of subsistence whatsoever, is actually instrumental in the differences that we see in these communities or in our interpretations. I will focus on the period that the entire day is focused on. As you can see, I put it between quotation marks, because one of the things, actually what I want to question is how useful is this term? For that I will focus on the following 5 aspects to see whether on any of these aspects we are able to define what Vlaardingen is. For starters, it is quite interesting, and I've only collected a few examples, that the pots that we consider so typical for Vlaardingen, again, if you pick them up and you put them in other areas of the Netherlands, they change their connotation. I already gave an example of a Vlaardingen pot ending up in Limburg and becoming Stein. But there are also settlements from the Vanderbeeker culture, and then we're talking about Northern European archaeology, so this is supposed to be very different. But some undecorated pots from Beekhuizer Zand, if you would pick them up and you would hide them in the assemblage from Vlaardingen or Hekeling, you would not see the difference. And then to the right, a beautiful color flasks. And here are examples from, the top one is a Vanderbeeker one, the middle one is coming from Stein, and the photo is coming from Wartberg. So even these very specific types of artifacts are shared across a very large area. It even continues all the way up to northern France. So it's very difficult, if you do not know where a pot is found, to label it as Vlaardingen. And I think that something similar is true for flint artifacts. It's also very, very difficult, and Lasso also wrote a good section on that in his thesis. So artifact types are rather similar, and on top of that, the analysis that I think will also be presented later today, the raw materials that were used to create these flints, they were mostly not from the wetlands, but they were using various sources from a much bigger area. And this is, let's say, an element that relates to this idea of being relatively autarkic. They were connected. And I have a third point here, activities with a question mark. Of course, thanks to this beautiful project, we now have a very good idea of the kind of activities that are preserved and that we can analyze making use of useware analysis. But how much do we actually know about the use of these artifacts beyond Vlaardingen? How many TRB settlements do we even have in the Netherlands? And how many artifacts from these settlements have been analyzed? 0. So how can then the results from what we see as typical Vlaardingen activities, how certain are we that they are typical Vlaardingen activities? Could they not also be found in the other regions? We have house plans, settlements, and I pick one example. So to the left is a house plan that was excavated in Den Haag a few years ago, and to the right are 3 house plans that were excavated near Eindhoven. Again, you see that these people in very different landscape made very similar houses. We can also talk about cereal cultivation, which the type of cereals do not seem to be so culturally significant in this period. Emmer wheat and naked barley are dominant probably in all sides of this period. The fields were also worked with similar tools. So we have these art marks. This is a photo from Groningen, but there are actually many more Vlaardingen cultivated fields that we have excavated than TRB ones. We can also talk about animal husbandry. I think that one of the things that I find still extremely intriguing is the variability that you have. If you have all these Vlaardingen sites, you make a long list, some of them are dominated by bones from domestic animals, others apparently are hunting stations, and everything in between. Is this perhaps typical for Vlaardingen? Well, I don't know. From TRB in Drenthe we have 0 bones. From Stein in Limburg we have 0 bones. This is certainly something that is not part of the current project. There is a lot to be said about this. To illustrate it, I will make use of an example from a project that has recently been finished in the Netherlands. So we've been working on one of the previous Neolithic phases of wetland occupation at Zwifterband. And here you see a graph of communities dating around 4200 BC, so quite a lot earlier than the Vlaardingen sites. We're looking here at the graph with stable isotopes, and for those people that are overwhelmed by the number of dots and how to read them, it's actually very simple. dots that are really close to one another make clear that these animals had a very similar diet, and if the distance is large between the dots, they had a very different diet. If you look at the yellow squares, these are cattle from the site of Zwifterband, and then you clearly see that there are two groups. So they had a strategy, an animal husbandry strategy that included two herds with different strategies. Currently under review is a paper that connects this also to strontium and oxygen isotopes, and the pattern is mirrored there. So we have one group locally kept and one which has isotope signals that refer to the uplands, so at least to the Veluwe, but it could also be much further away. I think this is the kind of data that could be added to also to the Vlaardingen period, to have a better idea of, let's say, the knowledge of these people. What were their strategies with their animals? Are there simply some cattle, or were these cattle important? Because here you can see there are two strategies visible that makes clear that they are not doing something, they have clear ideas. And also the genetics that were studied also make clear that they had full control over these cattle. Control, keyword. We can also look at human genetics, of course. If these Vlaardingen communities, these wetland communities, are more autarkic than other communities, you would also expect them to have perhaps a bit of a deviant genetic signal from groups that actually were more integrated in this Neolithic world. You can see the red dots, these are Vlaardingen/Corditware, and then the green dots are from Belgium. And the graph actually shows how higher up in the graph you are, how higher the percentage of Western hunter-gatherer genetics are found. So you can see it starts in the late Mesolithic, it's 100% Western hunter-gatherers, and then you see it slowly moving down, but you can also see that at every given moment there is still some variability. And you can also see that these Vlaardingen/Corditware individuals do not deviate from their Belgian counterparts. So they were equally integrated in Neolithic genetic exchange as their Belgian counterparts. For those aspects that we can compare, the characteristics of the coastal region sites do not differentiate from neighboring groups and regions. I think it would actually be better to talk about Neolithic on the coast than coastal Neolithic, because then we lose this implied reference to the wetlands and to the importance of hunting and gathering. No, these people were rather similar. I'm slowly arriving at the point where terms like Vlaardingen and also Stein are of limited use to structure our interpretation of this study area and time period, given the absence of distinguishing aspects of material culture. For sometimes in my classes in Groningen, I tell my students, we're running to the end of the life use of the culture concept. I think that before my retirement, which is 12 years from now, we will have abandoned it, also in Neolithic archaeology, as we have done in many other periods in the prehistory. And in other periods of Dutch prehistory, it was also quite common to talk about cultures. Culture, what else do we have? What really helped there is actually disconnecting these things. So we have now names for various ceramics, for houseplants, for other types of material culture. And we see that these are partly overlapping. So that is something that you can describe with the polythetic archaeological culture concept, already something that is also with us for a very long time. But I think that will not be the way forward, because it doesn't work. I've given you a series of examples where actually I don't see any overlapping or partially overlapping circles. The distinctions are very difficult to see if there are any. So I think we need to deconstruct more and not go to the level of this polythetic archaeological culture model, but we should expand the approach of the current Putting Life project to neighboring areas. So use the same toolkit, same questions, the same approaches to these other areas to see whether in the use of the flint, for example, or the use of the ceramics, we see any differences. We need to deconstruct more also by including more proxies in this larger region. Later today we'll talk a bit about the ceramic technology and petrography, making clear what the communities of practice were, whether pots were produced locally and those kind of things. Those are important aspects to better understand how communities are connected. But also, I've given an example, something that is relatively straightforward to do now. Stable isotope analysis and genetic analysis of bones from domestic animals will also inform us on strategies, husbandry strategies, making clear how important cattle was for them, and also about mobility of cattle, which of course is also a proxy for human mobility. So to conclude, I think we have the toolkit and we have the data to do this. The only thing that we need is a bit more money. Thank you very much.
very much, Daan. Any questions? We have time for small questions.
Hi, Daan. I have a question actually that relates to the point you make, indeed. So how do we use that term Vlaarding? I think I'm fully in agreement with you that the usability of that term is difficult. But maybe if you could go back to your slide on the ancient DNA, because you point out that there's 3 red dots that are labeled as Vlaarding.
Slash cornerware.
Exactly, slash cornerware. So we had this discussion on how do we label this, how do we interpret this. But I want to maybe you say, okay, they are not that different from, for example, the Belgian examples. But at the same time, all of these samples are very different from whatever happens beyond this geographical region. So would this not extend to the Belgian counterparts, and that, for example, we are viewing a sort of continuum where this Vlaardingen concept, however we can define it, is part of a Lower Rhine Meuse region where this type of culture is actually much more broadly spread than we initially recognized.
I think we are on agreement about this point. So, of course, in this presentation, I wanted to keep it small, and you already expand. Say that this no. So I think that if you would zoom out, then you're correct, and you will see different patterns. But what I find intriguing in the setting that we're here together is that we have this Neolithic on the coast. And then when we zoom out just a few hundred kilometers, that is actually the graph that is on the screen now, then this story fits for all the data points. But that the world outside that region is different, I think we all agree about. And of course, you can also ask, where are those bones in Belgium coming from? And are they typical for the occupation of what is now Belgium at that time? Of course, that is also a rather skewed data set as is ours.
I think this actually backs up the point that what we're probably looking at is the samples that we have here are from indeed specific context. They are from wetland context or from cave context. But we're lacking a lot of the other groups that are around, that we have evidence on, archaeologically speaking. So how do you see that dynamic then?
No, and again, that's where we agree. But my issue with this is actually why are we setting apart Vlaardingen from, for example, Stein, and including the entire narrative surrounding it, and we're not using the same vocabulary when we're talking about the people of which we find the remains in the Belgian, let's say the Belgian data points here. So somehow we cut off the Dutch wetlands from what is happening outside there, and I think that if there is a cultural border, then it's probably bigger than it's beyond the scope of this graph.
Thanks. Building on what also Contes said, don't you think that the coastal concept here is confusing, and that we should focus more on the wetland aspect, and that the fact that these people live in these environments, and these environments have specific affordances, also to some extent determine how they live there, and that might be different from maybe in material culture fairly similar communities in other places.
It might be, but it's this is a narrative then that is based on the absence of evidence.
Which you also use.
Yes, of course. Yeah, true. No, I'm just trying here to make clear what are the big challenges. And I think it is important to realize that this big narrative that we've all been raised with, that it is based on the absence of bone assemblages from the sandy area, for example. So that should perhaps make us, step one is good to be aware of that. And step two is then perhaps that we should think of ways to address this. So, and one of the things that I propose is to expand the kind of work that is being done in the current project. So think of the lipids, think of the SEM analysis, think of the use wear, and include settlements that we have in the sandy soils.
I fully agree. But I do think also that if you compare, for instance, Vlaardingen to Stein, you see also different burial tradition.
Would you expect a Stein type of burial vault in Vlaardingen?
No, of course not, because you don't have the stones, but you also maybe miss the type of cultural behavior that goes with that. So we
It
don't.
could be, yeah.
One question.
Yeah, I think there's positive evidence for what Luc is saying, and that's that there is absolutely no plant working traces on the useware analysis, on the useware study of Veldhoven Raemaekers. And I think also if I remember well, very little bone working as well. And there is some. So there is a considerable difference in activity pattern with a pretty large sample that was studied. So I think, as you know, I'm not a great fan of the concept archaeological culture either, but I do think there are differences between what is happening. And in that sense, I think Luc is right, that there are considerable differences. And maybe we should just see it as, well, I mean, there's variability, and we know there's variability. And however way you want to label it, that's a difficult thing. But to completely throw away, I mean, where does the Neolithic stops? I mean, it goes everywhere. And so can't we just
in the world that don't use the terms.
It's variability which is interesting.
Yeah.
And that's positive evidence that there is.
I think I agree, especially for this time. I think indeed we're looking at such different things in terms of what we know that we use too much. But I think for me, one of the things you also mentioned, the funnel beaker, I think there I do see sort of a border in many ways in terms of these flint X are very mobile for both regions. We see X being traded over hundreds of kilometers, but there's not a single funnel beaker style X in any of the Vlaardingen settlements. I feel that's a deliberate sort of a border that people would otherwise have been able to exchange those. Because in Drenthe you find X's from Denmark, and in Vlaardingen I find X's from Belgium. So for me that's sort of a border, and also in terms of burial rituals, there's not a single Vlaardingen inhumation grave with a pot. And of course you don't have a hunebed, but you could have something like Dalfsen in the Vlaardingen region, we don't have that. And also the wetlands, like the wetland sites, in fact we don't have settlements from the funnel beaker. I think if you would have similar Vlaardingen settlements, you also have a wetland area above that. But why didn't we find those in Friesland or, I don't know that area that well. But I would expect that if you have similar wetland sites in that area, you would have found them. So I do think there's maybe a difference there.
Do we have time for a small answer?
Yeah.
I agree with that the differences between the northern part and southern part are bigger, and I think that many of the problematic finds that are in the middle zone. So we have a pot from Zeewolde, these settlements, the settlement from Beekhuizen Zand, you have the pot from Neden. Those are the ones that are really tricky. But in general, I fully agree with you that these are different worlds. But I think I'm also coming back to the Veldhoven site. These patterns, they are right. At the same time, it's quite intriguing, and probably you never read the ceramic articles chapter of these publications. But you see that it is quite. They use quite a lot of text to, at a certain moment, decide whether to call it Vlaardingen or Stein. So if that is apparently something that is under debate, then it's a house of cards then. So I think that is I would say also one of the main takeaways of today, the extreme variability of the sites in many aspects. So the question is, are we certain that we have covered the variability, and can we use that as building blocks to talk about? I mean, before Veldhoven, we had no idea that there were also these big house plants, just as an example, and so on. So every few years we have still these breakthrough kind of sites. Dielmedel is also one, or Schipluiden, or Dalfsen, and then we have to rethink our entire database. That is quite. I think that should also make us cautious in the type of interpretations that we give. But I'm looking. My intention was to create debate. I think that is successful.